You are on mute, Sabyasachi.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining us today. Myself, Dr. Sabyasachi from RIS, and as I already said, a very good afternoon, very good morning, very good evening to all of you. I know all of you have joined from the widest possible time zones, and that same goes for our participants, not only on WebEx, but those who are also on YouTube Live. We definitely warmly welcome all of you for sparing your valuable time and accepting our invite so graciously and being with us today. It would be very important a subject to take up in the next 1.5 hours. I welcome our Director General, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, who has very meticulously guided us on this. Thank you, sir, and we look forward to your ideas. I also warmly welcome Mr. Rajiv Kher, who is currently our Distinguished Fellow at RIS, who has been our topmost trade policy maker. He was India's Commerce Secretary, so he would be moderating the session, a great privilege for us today. We are extremely fortunate to have all of you. Professor Carlos, thank you for joining us today. Professor Carlos is the Executive Director of South Center in Geneva. Professor Uri Dadush is joining us from Miami, Florida. It is very early morning for you. He is from Bruegel, and we all know about him. Professor Fuku Kimura, who is joining us from Tokyo. Thank you, sir. It's already very late for you, we understand. Dr. Clara Brandy from the German Development Institute, and Professor Devopriya Bhattacharya, who is also a very known to all of us and a great scholar from the South in representing the Southern Voice and the Center for Policy Dialogue in Bangladesh. We are, of course, waiting for Professor Chuka, who is the Executive Director for the Center for Study of Economics of Africa in Nigeria. We'll have him anytime soon. He has accepted our invite, and it's great to have him also in the panel. So thank you very, very much. Before I hand over the floor to the moderator, may I request our director, Professor Sachin, for his initial remarks.
Thank you. Thanks, Sabyasachi, for arranging this and for getting all of us together. So congratulations. I see that we are already joined in by our great friend from Nigeria, Dr. Chukwula. So warm welcome to him. And of course, our panel is all set now to begin the exercise. Friends, as you would agree, post-pandemic, the trade scenario is not looking very encouraging at this point. The UNCTAD report and the reports from many other independent institutions, the prediction for contraction is very much clear. We are already seeing contraction across some of the economies, and quite a few getting even pulled down with the major crisis that we're going to face in the next couple of weeks and months. And this crisis is not going to go away very soon as it is emerging. And we would have to live with it, and we would have to find solutions to see how we go forward. But at RIS, we thought that there is a need for developing countries who have been advised and have followed the idea of global integration, opening up the borders, and now are facing the crisis of production, supply, and of course the crisis of multilateralism. Particularly when WTO is going to celebrate the 25 years of its establishment, working, and of course the transition that we saw from GATT 25 years ago. What kind of dreams, ideas, and potential expansion for the institution that we is not entirely related to the pandemic. The crisis was already setting in for last few years, and we have seen the crisis of the dispute settlement panel that it faced last year, and it was widely commented upon. So we thought that world's leading lights who are leading the narrative setting on multilateralism, impressing through their writing, speaking, and of course in their individual capacities, have created this wave for multilateralism. And I think it's important that the intellectuals from the North and South get together to talk about how and in what manner we can go forward with this idea of multilateralism. So we requested Mr. Rajiv Kher and Professor S.K. Mohanty at RIS to spearhead a World Trade and Development report, which we would be coming out with in a couple of months' time. And this report is on its track. We would be in touch with our panelists in due course of time. But we thought that some sort of series should be initiated for discussion, and we thought that it would be good to have long friends who have been supporting RIS work for last couple of years, have been in touch with us at various platforms. And I'm very glad that Uri, whom I met at Saudi T20 and earlier at the German presidency meeting, Professor Kimura is an old friend of RIS. Carlos is part of the RIS family. Debuda is part of the RIS family. And we have Excel as part of our own initiatives. And I'm glad that Clara is standing in for Excel. And thanks to our mission in Nigeria, Professor Chukwu has joined us today. So a good panel has come in, and I think the four subsequent discussions that we have planned on international trade, investment linkages, and the IPR linkages, the idea of making the vaccine available, and the South Africa and India proposal on IPRs at WTO is an indication of intent of bringing the vaccine to the least developed countries, to the countries that cannot afford it, and those who are also constrained in terms of the R&D and access to vaccines. So for those countries, as SNDT and many other challenges are hovering around as we are moving forward, what kind of WTO we want, what kind of multilateral arrangements we want is the focus of today's panel. Being the most effective moderator, Mr. Rajiv Kher has already circulated questions to our panelists, and I'm sure this is going to be extremely exciting. And I'm keenly looking forward for the next three roundtable discussions that would be there. The floor is all yours, Mr. Rajiv Kher, for another 1.5 hours that we would enjoy with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sachin. A very good evening to all panelists and participants. Thank you very much, Sachin and Sabyasachi, for asking me to moderate this session. I am conscious of the fact that webinars attended with very distinguished panelists always fall short of time. So I don't want to take too much of time in introducing the subject. I don't have to introduce the panelists, that has all been done. And none of the panelists really needs to be introduced. They are all very distinguished and very well-known specialists and intellectuals in their respective areas. Sachin has already given a small understanding of why we are doing this and what is going to be followed by this particular webinar. In order to contextualize the discussion which follows thereafter, I would just like to make a few introductory comments and then would request the panelists to take over. It is no secret that the WTO is an existential crisis. It is not the fate of an institution alone, but the future of how the world community conducts its trade and commerce which is at stake. Because the kind of issues which are involved are multiple and the complexity of those issues all pervades. Now, WTO evolved at a time which was both economically and politically quite different. It was a unipolar world and economic power had yet so distinctly flow in some significant parts of the third world. But since then, three things have happened. Firstly, the multilateral trade regime manifested in the WTO rules architecture, on the one hand, preserved the asymmetries in favor of the traditional economic power, that is the advantage of the first mover. But at the same time, the then new paradigm of production distinctively benefited some countries of the developing world and the others. While this flow of economic gains brought prosperity in pockets of developing world, large chunks of territories were left still uninfluenced by it. Even in the developed world, excessive globalization brought there were allegations that some players manipulated the so-called free trade regime to their advantage by espousing policies and actions which the WTO was intended to deal with. Around the same time, a unipolar world gradually moved towards potential multipolarity but visible bipolarity. This further accentuated the economic fallout, and an institutional stalemate was arrived at. Hereafter, we are very familiar with the manner in which this has played out. Three developments have really suffused any discourse on WTO, or for that matter, any multilateral institutional evolution today, are the political context, and there are many subtexts in the political context. Second, I hope I am audible.
You are.
Thank you. Second, economic process and economic consequences have been far and wide, but yet disparities have prevailed. But one thing is very clear, that the direction of economic power is very clearly moving eastwards. And thirdly, technology and a variety of other issues which emerge out of the technology evolution, whether it is digital, whether it is in any sphere of life, have creatively sprung up new issues. And the critical aspect of any multilateral trade institution that we talk about will be how would that institution deal with these newer issues, whether it is structured to deal with those new issues, or you need to have a structural review of such institutions. So these are the kinds of challenges that WTO has faced, and it has not been able to respond to these challenges in the manner in which possibly the world expected it to, and that is what led us to face the present crisis. Now, coming to today's engagement, we have 6 very distinguished ladies and gentlemen here with us. I had, as Dr. Chaturvedi has already mentioned, I had circulated a set of questions to these distinguished experts. The idea behind, the idea behind this circulation was primarily to keep the discussion in focus and not let the subject drift, because as you heard, we have four such similar events to be organized in future. So we wanted each of the event to still essential learnings, each of them. And therefore, we have shared these questions with the panelists today. Since I do not intend to intervene once the panelists have taken over till we conclude, I would just, for the sake of the audience, just let you know that these questions are essentially driven around 5 concerns. The first is we need to understand whether WTO has been able to play a certain amount of influential or a critical role in the manner in which economic transaction, economic business is done in the world. So some sort of a balance sheet of the WTO. 2, what has led to the stalemate? And do we foresee some structural ideas, some structural prognosis which will lead us into some sort of a workable solution recognizing that we are sitting in a world, there are huge amount of asymmetries and there are huge amount of differences in perspectives. Thirdly, we have this big issue of non-reciprocity.
Let me talk to him. I think there is an issue.
Sabyasachi, we can move forward. I think he has some connectivity related issue.
Yes, sir. We can, of course, move forward, and with your presence, we can.
What will be what?
I just heard something, so yeah.
So
Please come back. Yeah.
We would like to discuss what sort of organizational structure do we need to deal with these emerging production systems as they move forward. And lastly, as I have already said, technology has played a very determinative role. Are we prepared in an institutional sense to deal with the spillouts of technology on the trading system? At present, we don't seem to be. How do we want to progress? That is a big question. I have 6 speakers here. I have shared with them my request for dealing with a specific issue, but that let me say that there's nothing sacrosanct about it. It is just to keep a discussion on the track. So I will not insist on their limiting themselves to those issues. Let me begin by requesting Professor Carlos Correa to begin this discussion. Professor Correa, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kerr, and thank you, Sachin, for the invitation to this webinar, and thank you for preparing it so well with the questions. So I will address the first question, which includes this balance sheet about the WTO performance, and also whether we should, as developing countries, advocate for the survival of the WTO or take a different position. Certainly, the WTO has contributed to significant growth in trade. It has been an influential organization. I think there is no doubt about this. But as was mentioned by Mr. Kerr, now the organization is in an existential crisis. So later will be some discussion about what the causes of this crisis are. So I will focus on the questions whether, in particular for developing countries, I am now representing the South Center, so I will try to convey the views of the countries. I understand them. So whether there are good reasons for developing countries or not to keep a functional multilateral system under the WTO. And my reply will certainly be yes. Developing countries need a functional multilateral system. The multilateral system does protect the smaller players in a system, but this is subject at least to 3 main conditions. The first one is the multilateral character of the organization should be preserved. The second one is that the system needs to be rebalanced. So we are talking now about reform, but maybe we need to talk about rebalancing the system. And the third condition is that the rules, in order to be effective, must be enforceable. So I will address these 3 points very briefly. The first one about the multilateral character. As you all know, there are now proposals going on, particularly by the United States and other developed countries, that aim at developing on the basis of the so-called joint initiative some plurilateral agreements. And it's very unclear so far how these plurilateral agreements will be absorbed by the system, whether this will lead to a multilateral system, a stronger multilateral system, or a fragmented system within WTO. As we know, one of the challenges that the WTO has faced over the years is the proliferation of bilateral or regional trade agreements. So we already have a huge fragmentation of the trading system. And then the further question is whether these plurilateral agreements will actually give this fragmentation more significance, or will be these plurilateral agreements be able to be absorbed within the multilateral system. Some members of WTO are talking not about plurilateral, but pro-multilateral agreements. But still, as I'm saying, it's very unclear how this process will go on. The second condition is about rebalancing. So the United States is proposing a reform, and other developing countries are also pushing this direction that may involve a weakening or abolition of the special differential treatment. It may mean, on the basis of this proposal on the non-market economies, it may mean that WTO will judge what kind of development model WTO members may follow or not. So this, I think, is a very dangerous approach. WTO should never be able to influence the way in which countries develop their economy. So the strategies, the extent of, for instance, of state intervention is something that each government should decide, each society should decide in order to pursue its priorities and development objectives. There are a number of initiatives regarding notification, transparency, so on and so forth. But the problem is that the starting point for this reform seems to be that the current system is well structured, is working well, I wouldn't say it's perfect, but is okay as it is. But our perspective is that, in fact, the WTO system needs to be rebalanced. There is an excellent book by Mohan Kumar, in fact, the chairman of RIS, the title of which is The Negotiation Dynamics of the WTO, an Insider's Account, in which there is a very good account of how the negotiations in the oral round took place and the number of flaws and asymmetries that the system actually contains as a result of the dynamics of the negotiations. And this is something that it is necessary to be taken into account. So any reform which is undertaken should start from this starting point that there is a need to rebalance the existing system today. I will just mention an example, and in fact, developing countries made a number of proposals since the adoption of the Marrakesh Agreement in relation to some of these issues, but let me just mention a few. The first one relates to the unilateral measures. As you know, the United States is still using the famous Section 301 in order to challenge policies of WTO members. The recent case was against China. But then one condition for the WTO system work is to allow any unilateral measure as the Section 301. This has not been achieved so far. In the case of agriculture, of course, there is a major asymmetry in terms, for instance, subsidies received by farmers in the United States. They received $19 billion last year, and they are receiving even more this year because of the COVID-19 packages. In the case of the European Union, as you know, subsidies reach almost $65 billion, and they are still receiving more because of COVID-19. Many developing countries have been excluded of using this tool, in some cases because of limited financial resources, but also because of WTO rules, also asymmetric, that the European Union, the United States can use these measures in order to support their farmers and compete even in international markets, but developing countries cannot do the same. In terms of subsidies, for instance, now a number of developing countries are providing massive subsidies to some high technology sectors. In the case of the United States, the semiconductor industry, for instance, is receiving massive subsidies. The Democrats are suggesting in the parliament a new bill, which is called the America Leads Act, that aims at providing a package of $350 billion US in support of the economy. 16 billion out of this will be just for the semiconductor industry in order to keep the leadership of the US industry in this field. So there is a major support given to industries. So although the narrative is that all economic actors are playing on the same level, the reality is not that. The case of the TRIPS agreement is another good example of asymmetries. Developing countries were not allowed to use very important measures such as local content performance requirements, which have been used widely in the past by developed countries. Industrial tariffs also provide good examples, although the average in developed countries has gone down. Tariff peaks and tariff escalation still affect significantly developing countries' exports to those countries. And one major asymmetry I would like to mention to end is the fact that the WTO has liberalized commerce in goods, has liberalized commerce in services. Now the United States is pushing for liberalizing the flows of data. But in the case of technology, the WTO system does promote a system of very strong appropriation under intellectual property. It's not about dissemination. It's not about liberalizing. It's not about making technology accessible for development, but just to keeping technology under monopoly rights. So this is a major asymmetry in the system. There is a recent book by the former ambassador of South Africa in Geneva, Faisal Ismail, that was published by the South Center. Is the WTO reform and the crisis of multilateralism, in which some of the elements of what is needed for reform of the WTO from the perspective of developing countries are spelled out. So I think in summary, we need to talk more about rebalancing of WTO rather than reforming the WTO. And the third and last condition that I mentioned refers to the need to have enforceable rules. As we know, I was already mentioned by Mr. Kerr, the appellate body now is dysfunctional. The United States is using the blockade of the appellate body in order to get some other results in the so-called reform and other areas. But this is key, certainly, in order to have a system which responds to the interests of all members, and in particular, in developing countries. So just to conclude, I think that if there is a talk about the reform of the WTO, perhaps should be the rebalancing of WTO. And then the aim should be to put WTO in the context of the broader multilateral system, which includes also framework for development, which is spelled out in the Agenda 2030. So WTO has operated in isolation. So we need to put WTO rules into the global multilateral system, including, for instance, human rights perspective or right to development. So right to development, the declaration to right to development should be one of the frameworks that need to be taken into account if the WTO reform is actually done. Thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thank you, Professor Correa. Thank you. May I now request Mr. Dadush to make his presentation, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, there's a lot that I agree with in what Professor Correa mentioned. So I was asked to address the question of what has caused the stalemate, and can we actually resuscitate the WTO? There is, in my view, a historic irony in even asking the question whether we need to resuscitate the WTO. It's an irony because trade has never been more important to the global economy and to developing countries than it is today. The pandemic, in my view, actually showed the importance of trade, not the opposite, as some, many have commented. During the pandemic, we realized how desperately dependent we are on international trade in medical products of all kinds. The vaccines and the medicines that are being developed typically, in many cases, by international cooperation. So it's ironic that we should be even asking this question, given the growing importance of trade compared to the time, say, 1990, just before the WTO was created. But it is a fact that we have a stalemate, and the stalemate is not new. It dates back at least to the Cancun Ministerial Conference in 2003, and the failure from that point onwards to move forward on the Doha Development Agenda. However, I should also point out that since 2016, we have moved into a new phase. We moved from a phase of stalemate of the WTO to the deconstruction of the WTO. And that's essentially the phase we're in now, mainly driven, but not only, by America First policies. So what are the reasons for the stalemate? I was asked to comment on this. These are well known, but I will repeat it. The stalemate is long-standing, and it reflects the fact that we have a hugely increased diversity of members compared to where we were under the GATT system. Now there are 164 or so members of varying stages of development, but also with the entirely new phenomenon where the largest trading nation is actually a developing country, which is China. So that complexity in the membership is one of the reasons that it's more difficult to reach agreement. Also, as mentioned, we moved from negotiating tariffs under the GATT, which is relatively straightforward, to include subsidies, agriculture, services, intellectual property, many other issues, which are far, far more complex. And the third reason for the stalemate is the way that the negotiations are conducted, and namely the single undertaking, where everybody has to agree on everything before anything is agreed. That approach to negotiations is simply inconsistent with the complexity of the memberships and the issues and the breadth of the issues that we have to deal with. I may say that even these enormous difficulties could have been overcome in recent years, as they were in the Uruguay round, but they could not be because of the divergence among the big players. In other words, if somehow the United States, EU, China, and India could have come to an agreement on the essential issues, we may still have been able to negotiate a conclusion to the Doha Development Agenda, and it would almost certainly have been the last big multilateral round we ever negotiated. But the fact is that we simply did not have that meeting, the meeting of mind. I should also mention that a part of the change in the attitude of the United States, but also Europeans, is that the end of the Cold War made the WTO, which underpinned the free market system and the free market ideology, makes the WTO simply less essential for the United States and for its NATO allies. So these are some of the complex reasons that explain the stalemate. And then we moved, as I said, into the deconstruction phase. The deconstruction phase is driven by the United States America First ideology, which is basically a view that the system as it stands, and we're not just talking about the trading system, but the kind of liberal economic system that we have, the view that this system as it stands has a negative benefits cost balance sheet for the United States. This is the view that the United States is a net loser from the system, which is another huge irony, because it's the United States essentially that built this system. And it's also ironic because many economists believe that the United States is the country best positioned with its technology and innovation from the continuation of the system as it stands. But, you know, there are different views on that. It's without a doubt that the deconstruction is accentuated by the growing rivalry with China and the view that, correct or otherwise, its state-driven system is not compatible with the WTO. Now, just a word about my views. I happen to believe that the deconstruction phase is likely to turn out to be an aberration, and that future US administrations, perhaps as soon as next January, perhaps as soon as 2 weeks from now, will take a more traditionalist foreign policy view, and that includes the WTO, and also a less confrontational stance, even if it's a competitive one, vis-a-vis China, and also vis-a-vis many of America's present allies. I also believe that even if Trump wins, future US administrations are unlikely to continue his policy of dismantling the present system. And there are many reasons for that. I have just published a paper on the Policy Center for the New South webpage. It's called After Trump, which sets out some of the reasons for this prediction. Last point I want to make is that the WTO must be resuscitated, and it probably will be. However, the WTO negotiations, as envisaged by Lamy and Zelig when they established the Doha Development Agenda, that system is gone forever and will never come back, in my view. A revived WTO, which I think will happen, will need to preserve important elements of the system, namely the principle of non-discrimination, special and differential treatment, a rules-based system with a functioning dispute settlement, effective monitoring and notifications. I think there's very little doubt about any of that. But the crucial negotiating function, which is the only way that the WTO can remain relevant over the next generation, 2 or 3 generations, the negotiation functions must adopt far more flexible approaches. And ideally, members should be able to negotiate both open and closed plurilateral agreements. Open plurilateral agreements that are critical mass, such as the Information Technology Agreement. This is an obvious path forward, in my view, and one that can benefit the whole membership. And there are many examples of interest in that approach. But I would also advocate the possibility to negotiate closed plurilateral agreements, such as the GPA, the Government Procurement Agreement, but adopting some modification of the consensus rule, for example, introducing the concept of a supermajority, and adopting clear modalities for how a closed plurilateral agreement should be structured in terms of new members joining, etc., etc. Last point I want to make is that I see the WTO as the bedrock of the international trading system, but only a part of it. I don't see the WTO as being, the only essential part of the system. Regional trading arrangements under Article 24 already play a vital role and will continue to play a crucial role, one that is increasing in importance simply because they are able to go deeper and deal with more complex issues. And they're also a vital source of innovation of rules and disciplines. Equally, the WTO is the bedrock of domestic rules and jurisprudence of commerce, which should be and are by and large consistent with the WTO. These play an essential role in assuring that trade is open and predictable and will continue to do so in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dadus. Thank you. May I now request Professor Dev Bhattacharya to take the floor, please? Professor Bhattacharya?
Yes, I'm coming in. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had been in all years listening to my predecessors, the two very eloquent speakers who I know very much by reputation and off and on by interaction. So, they have made my life easier. They have put the broader framework issues very eloquently, and they have put forward a position both from the principles of economics and possibly also some value-based approach to build a rule-based trading system. So let me come to the issue very straight away. Mr. Chair, you have given me an issue which relates to the special and differential treatment, I understand. And if you have just heard my two other eminent colleagues just now, they have made the point that special and differential treatment is it can enable this, characteristics of a rule-based open multilateral system and a WTO system in particular. And even if you recreate a WTO under new circumstances, this one has to stay. So that's a good proposition, and let me build on that. Now, the issue of special and differential treatment in the current context has acquired new importance from a couple of new perspectives. One is, of course, because of the coronavirus and the need to rejuvenate the world economy and the developing economies in particular. So the special and differential treatment may play the issue of non-reciprocity, as you put it, Mr. Chair, will play a role in this case, how to resuscitate the global economy, and particularly the more affected in the long term or medium term, the developing economies. The second one, I think, is also related to COVID, but in a more specific way. It is public access to vaccine, and particularly for the weaker economies, how they are going to get it, whether it will become, as some of us wanted, as a global public good, and to look at it as a global public good and particularly available for the more marginalized economy. And the third context in which this special and differential treatment has acquired new meaning is in the broader context of the reforms of the WTO. And that is where the whole discussion about the eligibility and the differentiation discourse about the membership come in, the basic point. So there are two immediate issues, and then one is that broader issues in the background. Now, just to summarily recall what happened with the special and differential treatment, we all know that the special and differential provisions for special treatment to the developing countries and the LDCs in particular had been built into the WTO system in the architecture and also in the operational modality and also in the obligations attributable to specific member states. Now, so this came along with the Marrakesh Agreement, but got a special, I think, impetus during the Doha Declaration, when we agreed, I think Article 44, when we agreed that to make these, identify these special and differential treatment measures and make them more effective and inclusive and more visible in the process. And you know that we tried to do that throughout the late 90s and throughout the 90s, and also partly in the early part of 2000. And then in 2014-15, we got into the whole, brought together the ACP countries, the Africa group, the LDCs. I think this group of 90, when they proposed this, the proposal of is 84 out of 25, and then 90, all these things came in. And then finally, I think in March 20, we have this proposal coming in of 10 proposals in certain ways. We have our views about how good they are, but there had been in these proposals. Most recently, the special and differential treatment has come into more discussion because of the the discussion on special and differential treatment to be accorded to the graduating least developed countries, the international support measures for the graduating LDCs. And since there is no such group as such, how this will affect both the other developing countries and the graduating LDC had been also a matter of great technical discussion in that way. So this is the historical background. Now, what has happened? So the traditional position of the South, as you know, that we think that special and differential treatment is part of the Uruguay architecture. It comes from there. And then we have an unfinished agenda, the Doha round, notwithstanding the Hong Kong, where the 5 LDC issues were up to a point addressed. And thereafter, so there is, so for many of us, it is that the Doha remains unfinished and many other issues unresolved. So we continue with the momentum of starting from the Uruguay round and thereafter. Whereas we see that there is a growing proposition, obviously led by United States with its submission on differentiation, that where it starts to say at least 3 things. The issue of that you cannot be the whole issue of being a developing countries cannot be automatically entitle you to some kind of special provisions. And so the general proposition that US and others are making, that countries who should be able to contribute should be contributing based on its capacity. What does the capacity mean? That's another issue, but we will come to that. The number 2 is that the capacity may be, or ability of the country to take on new obligations should be relative to their per capita income. And for that matter, the high income countries, which would be in number almost 83, should be automatically considered out of the loop of the special and differential treatment. So it's the identification issue in that way. And the third, method which is being said, and that how to bring in a bit of a differentiation instead of a blanket proposition of all developing countries, all countries are developing countries, I mean, other than the self-declared OECD's DAC countries, that it can be voluntary declaration. A country may voluntarily withdraw from the proposition. So there are 3 issues which are on the table at this moment. One is based on capacity, the other is based on income, the other is based on self-declaration. In the recent past, both South Korea and Brazil have opted for the third proposition. That is coming to that they would not they will not ask for any special privileges on special and differential treatment. Now, as you can see, the discussion has 2 levels here. One is a framework discussion. Who are these and who are these countries and who are entitled to what? And the other is there are specific treaties and specific negotiations, however good they are at this moment. How do you really reflect them in those cases? So I say that I look at it at 2 levels, the framework level and also the specific treaty level as it goes on to the discussion. To put this discussion into in certain perspective, what we may like to do is that, how do we take this discussion forward? One approach is, of course, we resolve the grandfather issue, and then we deal with the grandchildren. That we deal with the framework first, and then we will deal with that. But there are other ways of looking at it, is that instead of touching the big issue at this moment, which is very, very, at this moment, in an inflammable situation, definitely till November this year, and till the election day. And so we deal with specific issues. What is the historical experience we have in this case? If you look back, and I look back to my days in WTO when I was there, leading the discussion, particularly in the July ministerial of 2008, that was the last opportunity to close the Doha negotiations, that we'll talk about, and then we'll at that time bringing in the trade facilitation discussions, and we tried to build in this special and differential treatment, which is on some kind of a self-assessment basis. That we said, who are the countries who are capable of taking on the obligation on A, B, C, what you can do at this moment, how you're going to sequence it, and who needs technical assistance, who does not need technical assistance. And even if you need technical assistance, do you need it prior to any commitment or not? So, this was an operational way of putting special and differential treatment in action without waiting for the grandfathers to agree upon these things. So the grandchildren did this kind of things over there. So is there an opportunity to do this kind of thing in the future as the highly inflammable political issues are being settled out there? I make the point that this can be now tried out in case of fisheries subsidies. This negotiation is currently on, and we can try out and see whether we can get some kind of an very more smarter ways of putting in special and differential treatment into this specific treaty, and not getting stuck with it because of the big discussion is not resolved. The other solution, which is very much on the table, knocking at the door, and coming from Bangladesh, it will be a self-serving thing for me to say that what would be the ISM, international support measures for the graduating LDCs. This will be another case where special and differential treatment being accorded to a set of countries which never existed. So it is a group of countries within the developing countries which we are talking about. So there are a number of legal incoherence over there, whether you do an enabling clause like putting into the European Union support, or the provisions of another 3 years or something, or 6, or you do a waiver over there. How do you use this kind of instruments over there? So there are technical interesting issues over there. It's not just we want to have it and we have it. You'll have to also show the technical way how to get onto it. That is the beauty of WTO, that if just making a principle position does not help you. You'll have to technically take it through in the process. So my general conclusion is that, along with this, as we did in the trade facilitation, we need to look into the fishery subsidies as a case in point. We need to look at the graduating LDCs as a case in point. We look into the plurilateral, open-ended or closed, whether how we built in special and differential treatment over there in those cases. And we also look into the new mega regional or sub-regionals, how we use all those cases. So my basic point is, even if we do not have an agreement on the overall architecture on special and differential treatment, maybe a framework agreement on special and differential treatment has come and gone, but it does not mean that we abandon the special and differential treatment provisions for the ongoing negotiation which are over there. But for that, my concluding point is that we have to be a bit more smarter and try to play the way the games are now currently evolving. And we should be careful about the power relationship, which and the variable geometry which is happening, and the heterogeneity of the southern countries as well. And we have to be able more realistically as we move. My concluding proposition is that, Mr. Chair, you are here with a very auspicious duty of reviving the WTO. I can see that, and I congratulate you and welcome you for that very auspicious, vision and aspiration. But suppose, even if the patient dies, the WTO, I would like to resuscitate, save the conscience of that patient, and that is special and differential treatment. So even if the patient dies, let us have the conscience preserved. Let us protect the special and differential treatment in the new circumstances, in the new way, with the new issues. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya. Very well said. Thank you. May I now request Professor Kimura to kindly make his presentation, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this great opportunity. Thank you very much. So my homework is a digital trade and who gains and how. So this is sorry.
Mr. Kerr, you are on mute, sir.
No, I notice a certain disturbance. So if microphones are on, except Professor Kimura's, they may be switched off, please.
So may I continue?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, please.
Thank you. I just want to make 3 points quickly. The first point is to confirm that the digital trade or digital technologies are now very important for economic development. This is could be taken for granted, but I think India already shows us a bunch of examples to learn. But what sort of channels we have to utilize digital technology for economic development? I think the three major channels exist. The first channel is digital connectivity. This is very obvious under COVID actually. Digital connectivity is different from physical connectivity. So we know that in order to save rural people, and then it's like physical connectivity used to be very, very important. But now digital connectivity is coming in. Some parties are substitutable, but mostly complementary actually. So physical connectivity moves goods and people. And still we need a movement of goods and people. But in digital technology, that carries data, information, and digitized services. I think those are extremely important for relatively poor people. So people can have better access to goods and services for consumption directly. And also in India is a good example. The e-government is really coming in to go to a sort of rural people too. I think that aspect cannot be understated because it is really important going to people's welfare directly. That's the first channel. Second channel, to enhance productivity in existing industries. So starting from very traditional industries like agriculture, fishery, or transportation, or cottage industry, I think we can revitalize traditional industries. At the same time, in say manufacturing production networks, again the introduction of some part in IT using industrial robots or automation, and at the same time using communications technology to reduce servicing costs. I think those are extremely important now. So that's the second channel. Third channel, we are having new businesses certainly. Starting from relatively simple ones, information carrying, matching, and actually we used to we are experiencing a sort of relatively easy expansion of the market for matching. But from now, maybe a little bit more difficult one. We have to utilize IT much more intensively to make a sort of real innovation activities. But that's a third channel. I think that the developing countries really have to utilize those three channels in a full manner to accelerate economic development. Then the second point is that in order to do that, we have to have a good policy environment. I'm talking about both domestic and international, actually. Certainly, say if you have a free flow of data, anybody can use the data, and that generates a lot of benefits. But what we are worrying about free flow of data, certainly we have economic concerns, social concerns, and also we have a big problem in regulation in data-related businesses. And for some countries, still thinking of some sort of industrial policy to raise up those kind of industries. How we can set up a sort of a system of policies. I think that's extremely important, but people do not talk about that much. I think that's very, very important. So certainly we are worrying about, say, GAFA and others, and what's the problem, and what is a sort of a policies now people are discussing. We have to have a sort of a reasons why we need a policy, and what sort of policy should be the first best policy. I think we have to think of those kind of things much more seriously. So why is the free flow of data problematic? So one is economic concern. So we would have externalities, positive and negative, or so then we have to go to say, if we have unfair competition, then we have to utilize competition policy. If we have IP protection worry, then we have to use IPR, or consumer protection, then we have to do that. So I think economic concerns, we really have to have one-to-one relationship over there too. And also, second is a social and possibly political concern. Certainly privacy issues, actually country by country, how far we have to protect privacy data. Actually, we do not have any consensus yet, actually. Things are now much more confusing right now, but we have to define the privacy to be protected, and then we have to utilize that specific policy. And also cybersecurity, much more sensitive matters, and how to make a sort of value judgment between economic efficiency versus national security. I think that's a really, really difficult question, certainly, but we have to really think about that very seriously. Many countries are utilizing cybersecurity law for protecting domestic industries sometimes, or so using some other purposes. I think we really have to have a good relationship with the purposes and the measure. And then industrial regulation, that's a big problem too. Taxation now, so many are talking about the digital tax. That is, is it a sort of really a sort of justifiable policy as a first best policy? If this is a second best policy, then how we would remove distortion? We have to talk about that much more seriously. And also financial regulations, once we have fintech, e-payments, we have to talk about that. And for GAFA and others, probably the very, very important thing is information disclosure, actually. Nobody claims an information disclosure, I think, but that's a really fundamental issue that we have to claim. We have to request or force them to disclose information. And also code of conduct by governments. Say, so in some countries, data are really collected by governments, and this is sometimes for good purposes, sometimes really a sort of a political manipulation. So I think we need to set up some sort of code of conduct by governments too. Then going to industrial policy. So it's natural that the countries would like to raise up their own industry. But so we really have to make a sort of judgment that is really a sort of efficient policy, workable policy or not. And also, eventually, we have to talk about some sort of international rule for using those kind of industrial promotion policy. So I think we have to apply the first best policy as far as possible. I think going back to a sort of essence of economics, I think that's very important for this segment. The third point, WTO. So this may be controversial in sort of audience in India, but WTO as a negotiating forum is substantially weakened. We have to admit that. And then WTO has not been successful in catching up with new agenda like e-commerce and others. And actually, those should be taken care of by multilateral channel, definitely, but it was not successful so far. So now many countries believe that in order to set up a new rule, say the straight talk in WTO only may not work. So many countries are going to some forums that could be like-minded countries gathering, or sometimes a trial for plurilateral channels, or maybe mega FTAs. So I think it's very important that even if the starting point is those kind of fora, we really would like to go back to multilateral channels, WTO, but if just we wait for a sort of a talk only in WTO, things are not moving forward. Many countries believe like that. So I think in the case of e-commerce, now we are having a like-minded countries gathering. I think that is going to be very, very difficult, but important. So China is there, and other countries are there. India is not there yet, I guess, I believe. But I think it's very important. Countries are having different notions for the policy system right now. But what will be a sort of a common denominator? We really have to talk about that very seriously. So that could be that could set up a basis for institutional building, and maybe a sort of really, really thin agreement on that. But still, this is a sort of a starting point for multilateral rulemaking. And also, that kind of talk would revive the WTO to some extent as a negotiating forum. I think we have to think about that kind of channels. Maybe some strong multilateral channel believer would say that, oh, that's a really dirty way to do. But I think we have to face the reality and utilize various kind of channels, but try to go back to WTO. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kimura. May I now request Dr. Clara Brandy for her presentation, please.
Who did you ask?
Yeah, please. Yeah, Dr. Clara Brandy.
Okay, sorry, the connection was bad.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I may be missing on the wrong pronunciation. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm very sorry. If I'm allowed to share slides, I would also. But I can start already.
Yes, you can start, and we'll allow you to share your slides soon.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for inviting me to join this discussion. It's a huge pleasure and honor to be here. And I will speak a little bit about the contagious effects of the pandemic on developing countries through global value chains and what this might mean for the WTO, and about the promises and pitfalls of global trade cooperation for building back better. Just a few spotlights to get the discussion going. Yes, so we know trade and trade policy are important, and the previous speakers have underlined this, and my bottom line main message is that despite current some calls for deglobalization, renationalization, reshoring of global value chains, I think the pandemic shows that global trade cooperation is more important than ever, and thus the WTO remains very important, and in fact also as more important than ever. So global trade cooperation and WTO reform should be very high on the agenda. So we know that trade policy reactions have gone into two types of directions. On the one hand, there has been a reduction of import barriers. So more than 70 countries have cut import barriers to COVID-19 medical supplies and medicines. And I can show you the slide in a second. But there has also been a reaction to the other kind of direction, an increase in export restrictions. So more than 70 countries have limited their exports of medical supplies. And this, of course, is important in a very highly interconnected world with fragmented global value chains. And the fact that trade policy is key in the wake of the ongoing pandemic is also shown by this picture here, because applied tariffs on key COVID-19 products are high. They're high on average, with over 6% in fact, the 20 developing countries with the highest number of cases earlier this year. So this high concentration of imports in certain products make many countries and many developing countries extremely vulnerable to changes in policies by exporters or by other countries. So this again underlines the interconnectedness of our global economy and how important it is to take that into consideration in the current crisis. So, of course, countries are facing many hazards already, but they're facing additional hazards stemming from their integration into global value chains in this highly interconnected world. There are, of course, a number of analyses by now available on the repercussions for trade in value added, and I've listed some references here. But we still lack a detailed understanding of how the pandemic transmits through global value chains, especially in developing countries. And we have actually conducted a study on this, focusing on a sample of developing countries in different areas of the world. We try to study the economic vulnerability of developing countries to disruptions of GVCs due to the pandemic. And we use data on trade and value added for a sample of 12 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The goal is to assess their dependence on demand and supply from the three main hubs, China, Europe, and North America. So we look at demand and supply and disruptions both in demand and supply. And the idea is that using first estimates on COVID-19 induced changes in production and in sectoral final demand, we can obtain some early projections and estimations of the GDP effect of the pandemic that runs through trade in GVCs. So a few words about findings, and if you're interested in the study, I can send you the link as soon as it's published. It's forthcoming. So overall, we find that for the set of 12 countries, there are adverse demand side effects that reduce GDP by up to around 5%. Collapsing foreign supply is responsible for a drop in GDP of a similar measure. And we also find that countries, the countries that are most affected are those countries that are highly integrated into GVCs, for example, Southeast Asian countries. And one example here that stands out is Bangladesh. The GDP of Bangladesh, 4.5%, according to our estimations of Bangladesh GDP, are at risk alone through the demand shock and demand shifts in Europe, the lockdown earlier this year. So only one hub that is affected has this pretty substantial effect, according to these estimations based on value added. At the same time, of course, well-integrated countries also benefit from a well-diversified portfolio of, say, foreign suppliers. And this can help cushion the economic downswing of spillovers from other regions, also because COVID strikes different hubs at different times. And more generally, diversification, of course, helps to cushion against external shocks. So the goal, of course, looking at these numbers should be to make supply chains more resilient. And the crisis has underlined this. Our findings also underline the importance of diversifying the reliance in terms of demand and supply. So diversification is of course key, and this is well known, but the crisis again underlines this. One key question that has come up in this crisis is, what does this mean, this vulnerability through GVCs in this fragmented, very interconnected world economy? Should we rather turn inwards? Should we focus more on reshoring and reducing our exposure to international trade? Deglobalization, renationalization, question mark. But my view is that it is much more promising to actually get together, to cooperate, to go for concerted action, to counter disruptions in GVC and to counter growing protectionism. So there should be a plea for more cooperation rather than less, for more concerted action rather than reshoring of value chains and going alone. So cooperation in the global trade system and beyond is key, using trade as a leverage for building back better. So for a sustainable recovery that takes into account hopefully also sustainable development and environmental protection. So trade should be a key leverage for building back better. In terms of environmental protection, it is of course very tricky to make progress at the multilateral level, and we've heard several aspects of this difficulty already. But the good news is that there is also preferential and plurilateral action that we can take, and this has also been mentioned by the previous speakers. And I just want to show the potential of trade and environment preferential agreement linkages that can generate synergies potentially. So we looking at this idea of building back better and linking trade and the environment. The graph on the left shows trade agreements, so preferential trade agreements, PTAs, and environmental provisions in these agreements. And we can see the black line shows that the number of environmental provisions in these PTAs has been increasing strongly over the past years. And we have all kinds of different environmental provisions in these trade agreements that can help address different aspects of environmental protection. And if you are interested in details, you can look at our visualization of this data provided by Jean-Philippe Morin on our interactive visualization page to look at the very specific details in these trade agreements. And the overall message is that yes, environmental provisions have been included in trade agreements, but there's substantial potential for synergies that remains untapped. And that's also something that has to be kept in mind when going forward, building back better and using trade for sustainable recovery. At the same time, we do not only need to focus on preferential agreements, but of course, there are also many plurilateral initiatives that have been mentioned before, also in the context of trade and environment, and perhaps a revival of the environmental goods agreement, and also the ACTS initiative by a number of countries can be promising ways forward. So last but not least, let me end with a few words on the way forward. I think global cooperation is key for building back better global trade cooperation, and the WTO is needed to strengthen trade cooperation. Trade cooperation can be essential as an enabler of a sustainable recovery. It can help tackle global health challenges by providing better access to medical equipment and medicine. It can help to diffuse environmental technologies and also by help taking back current export bans and restrictions. Trade facilitation can be a good way forward to speed up the clearance and release of critical goods. There can be programs that can be facilitated to ensure cross-border movement of health professionals, and this has been mentioned. We should reflect on the role of trade for access to new vaccines, to pharmaceuticals, and of course we should push the reforming WTO agenda because the multilateral trade system is important for building back better. And I think the G20 can help to keep up the momentum for WTO reform among many other players, but the G20 could engage key stakeholders of the trade system, including of relevant international organizations, in a dialogue, hopefully on a multi-year agenda to prioritize reforming the WTO. And one way forward could be to create an eminent trade expert group in the context of the G20 that reports on an annual basis on the process of strengthening the trade system and reforming the WTO. And I think when we look at reforming the WTO, we should focus both on the very big questions that have been raised in this webinar already, but perhaps also focus attention to the more low-hanging fruits of improving, for example, the work of the committees, to improve the transparency in the WTO. So focus on the very big and challenging issues that have been mentioned here, including special and differential treatment, but also hopefully some of the more low-hanging fruit to show that, that we can make progress with WTO reform and with strengthening the multilateral trade system going forward to help us deal with this crisis and future crises that we're facing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. May I now request our last speaker, Dr. Chukwuka Onekena, to make his presentation. Dr. Onekena, we shared the questionnaire with you, but I would be very clear if you would speak on Africa's response to WTO's reform process and how much has Africa benefited from the WTO presence. I mean, if you could touch upon this perspective in your presentation, besides, of course, whatever you wanted to say. Thank you. Your microphone is on mute, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very glad to be part of this very important and relevant discussion on WTO. I wasn't quite assigned any issue to discuss, but like you said, I can bring in some African perspective to the discussion, particularly as previous panelists have spoken on asymmetries and imbalances within the WTO. So I will touch on those points briefly in, from an African perspective, bring it into the discussion. So I'll start by saying that despite the importance of trade in achieving development and improving lives of the ordinary citizens across the world, the progress of WTO, which is essentially an overseer of the global trade rules, has been stalled by issues such as the rising Sino-American trade tensions, and also the weakening of globalization as countries seem to be turning inwards and localizing supply chains. And then worse still, recently, restrictions to movement, increased demand for essential commodities, and the rising uncertainty which has been induced by the recent COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated countries' reluctance in engaging in global trade and globalization in general. Africa as a continent has always been on the unfavorable end of the bargain, with the continent trading mainly in agricultural goods and natural resources. And this has persisted for a very long time, rather than trading in manufacturing and services. Africa's trade accounts for only 2% of the global exports. And the breakdown in global trade negotiations has particularly affected the African continent, as evidenced in the halt of the Doha round of trade negotiations, meant to primarily address issues of agricultural access to developed country markets and address other inequalities in a global trading system which has continuously been skewed against developing countries. But despite these challenges, Africa still believes that trade is key to delivering development to its citizens, as evidence to the wide support for the recent African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The continent believes that the increased presence in both regional and global value chains will likely provide economic opportunities for the large population of 53 countries. It has the potential to increase income and living standards of the population, and also essentially promote economic diversification, because that's a key issue among African countries. However, it will be difficult for the continent to achieve these gains without a reform of the WTO in areas that address these trade imbalances that have been mentioned earlier within these discussions. And I'll point out just two of them as they pertain to Africa's challenges. One is the WTO special and differential provisions for least developed countries, that it should permit African governments to provide temporal tariff protection for infant domestic manufacturers within WTO rules. And what this would do is that nascent industries can be provided support that they need to grow and deliver better gains. Another point to mention is that the institutional crisis within the WTO needs to be resolved. Its dispute settlement system strengthened to encourage African countries to take on stronger world powers in order to discourage the use of Africa as a dumping ground for substandard or wanted products. And on the last point, drawing on a point earlier made by Professor Korea on geographical balance, we believe that to achieve the institutional reforms and make WTO serve not only for the first world powers, but also for developing countries, particularly in Africa, there needs to be a competent, experienced, and African development expert with established relationship with global powers, but also having local knowledge and experience in delivering reforms for developing countries. And on that note, I would like to bring the point of the leadership of WTO mentioned that the idea of an African leader, as a head of as a DG of WTO, it seems to be quite a move in the right direction, as she is positioned to build the bridges between the US and China on one hand, and also between WTO and Africa. So there's a full support for that development from Africa. And on that note, I'll end this. I'll say thank you for giving me attention to make this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. And my congratulations on that last wait for a potentiality. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have now completed all the speakers.
So can you hear us?
Yeah.
Mr. Kerr, I am trying to reach him. There seems to be an issue. Yeah, I think we have amongst our participants Professor Donald Lewis. Yeah, sir, we can hear you now. Yeah. So there is a problem in your connection.
Ask his question or make comments?
Yes. Yeah. Professor Donald Lewis, he's here. Professor Donald Lewis, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Saya. I'm very thankful and grateful for having the opportunity to pose the first question. It's very stimulating RIS forum. My question relating to, of course, the WTO reforms is as follows. The US, Japan, and the EU have articulated certain plurilateral proposals on WTO industrial subsidy reforms, which are going to be on the G20 agenda at Riyadh next month. What are the panelists' views on the substantive merits of these proposals? Is this an attempt to target China's use of subsidies, or a focused agenda to undertake overdue revisions to the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement? On a related point, should the WTO introduce a special discipline for state-owned enterprises along the lines of the CPTPP and or the USMCA? If so, what would such a WTO discipline look like? What issues would it address? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Lewis.
Who would like to take this question in the panel? Both of them, very interesting questions. May I request Professor Dadush to respond if he can, or Professor Kimura, Professor Korea?
Yeah.
I may, if you allow me.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, thank you for this very relevant question regarding this proposal for industrial subsidies and the issue of state-owned enterprises. First of all, I think that's a very complex proposal. As is suggested in the question itself, is perhaps mainly aimed at the situation in China. But if these new disciplines were introduced, it will not affect only China, it will affect all members, and in particular developing countries. So in my view, this is not an approach that should be supported. It will just expand the disciplines and then put some limitations to policies that developing countries can use in order to pursue their own industrial development. So the history shows that industrialized countries, that those who are industrialized today, they use a lot of policies of this kind in the past, including, as I mentioned before, some which are now prohibited under the regimes. So if these proposals were adopted, then it would mean that developing countries will be deprived of the possibility of using the tools that industrialized countries used in the past in order to have their own economies and industries grow. So I would say that this is not a proposal that, from the perspective of developing countries, should be looked at in a positive manner, but more as a challenge to the policy space that developing countries need to preserve in order to industrialize. On the second one, on whether special rules should be developed on state-owned enterprises, as I mentioned before, the model of development, the extent to which state-owned enterprises participate in the economies is something that should be left for different countries to define. It is up to them to determine what model of development they follow. It would be, again, a very dangerous policy to allow for the WTO to become the ultimate judge of the kind of development strategy that the members pursue.
Thank you, Professor Correa. Professor Dadush, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of points. I do believe that the main objective of the industrial subsidies, in this case, initiative by the three, is in fact targeting China. At the same time, that doesn't mean that an initiative on industrial subsidies is not actually potentially a very important initiative for improving the workings of the world trading system. I think it is. And as Professor Correa said, the effect would be far, far broader than China. And I'm not just referring to the developing countries, but also to the advanced countries. Indeed, one of the longest running disputes at the WTO is between Boeing and Airbus, the subsidies to Boeing and Airbus, which are, of course, European and American manufacturers, but there are many, many other examples. And with the COVID crisis, this issue has become even more complex. But definitely my view would be that it is what should be one of the objects for improving the rules and workings of the world trading system going forward, and including for China, but including for the advanced countries and many developing countries as well, where industrial subsidies are a part of the problem. They're often wasteful, and they're often the results of political influence and corruption rather than genuine public interest. And that includes the advanced countries as well. So that's on industrial subsidies. As far as state-owned enterprises are concerned, again, this is clearly an issue targeting China, primarily. However, again, you can say many of the same things that I said about industrial subsidies for state-owned enterprises. There's many state-owned enterprises in Europe. For example, the United States happens to be a country where there are relatively few truly state-owned enterprises. Here, as far as SOEs are concerned, I agree with Professor Correa that you want to have as much as possible policy space for individual countries to pursue the system that they think is most effective for them, that reflects local conditions. At the same time, these discussions have introduced an important concept, which bears taking care of, which is called competitive neutrality. In other words, what this concept says is, yeah, you can have state-owned enterprises if you want to have state-owned enterprises in a specific sector, but you have to structure it in a way that it does not affect international competition in a major way. And here I want to underline one point. Although the SOEs under question are very often Chinese SOEs, in fact, when you look at the way many Chinese SOEs, that's not all of them, but many Chinese SOEs are actually oriented towards domestic market or towards international markets where, in fact, international competition is relatively limited and their distorting effect is small. That doesn't mean all Chinese state-owned enterprises belong in that category. But my sense is that in many instances, the problem is overstated. But where there is a problem, the concept of competitive neutrality, I think, is a very useful one. Stop there.
Thank you, Professor Dadush. Professor Kimura, would you like to respond to that? There are two very interesting.
I notice a sort of a quite difference from what we are talking about in developed countries like Japan. I think at least in subsidy issues, say for example, reporting a system of subsidies and others, so certainly once subsidies are really affecting a sort of market competition, then we have to have some sort of discipline at least. And then I think subsidy articles related to subsidy are not really well organized and well implemented. So how far we would step into sort of regulating those kind of subsidy? I think we have many things to do in order to at least keep a sort of a healthy market competition. Probably that would be a sort of popular argument in Japan and other countries.
Thank you. I see two questions on the chat box. May I request the panelists to have a look at that, and if they would like to take them for answers. The first one is not really very clear, but the second one, I think more or less, well, second one doesn't really concern WTO in that sense, but yes, if anyone would like to respond. Arbitration tribunal. Would Professor Correa, would you like to respond to this question on arbitration tribunal?
No, I'm very sorry. I cannot see questions, or I cannot. I don't know whether I have access to.
Shall I read it? I'll read it. Well, the question is multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement initiated by EU would be effective in saving WTO dispute settlement mechanism? Question mark. I think the questioner is basically asking your opinion on whether it would or whether it would not.
Well, in my opinion, this arbitration agreement it should be a temporary arrangement as well as it is intended, but it cannot really substitute the appellate body. So the appellate body should be back and operate. Arbitration is not the same as applying the rules and making the clarification of the rules as demanded by the dispute settlement understanding. arbitration is not exactly the role that the appellate body has played and needs to play. So I think this is not, this shouldn't be seen as a permanent solution to the problems that WTO is facing today.
Absolutely, yeah. Anyone else would like to respond to any of the other comments? There are not many. Well, I think they're not very clear what exactly the global political structure is lacking a clear leadership versus national. Well, it is something which has been spoken in the context of this global pharma nationalism. Dr. Clara Brandy spoke about it in the COVID context. Dr. Brandy, would you like to look at this? Can you see this on your chat box?
Yes, I can see the question. But I'm not exactly sure.
It's many things mixed in one.
I think nationalism is the wrong way forward. I think global is the better way forward. I would also second the argument made by Mr. Hauka to all panelists that yes, WTO Secretariat research capacity, strengthening this could be a good way forward to provide a better basis for WTO reform, which should be really high on the agenda in the organization itself.
Right, right. Okay. Well, Sabyasachi, would you like to call it off, or you have time for anything else?
So if you have any other observations on this very enlightening discussion.
I have a limited observation to seek Professor Kimura's perspective on one thing, which will take a short while if you allow, if your time allows.
Please, another 5 minutes for sure.
Okay, fine.
Yeah,
Professor Kimura, this is why I asked you this particular question is because Japan has been mentioned in this context, and this is about that resilient value chain initiative between Australia, Japan, and India. Earlier also there has been a reference to Japan specifically looking at relocations in some context. Well, that's been the way it has been reported. I just wanted to understand from you what do you see the way in which the value chains would move in future, and how do you see them 5 years down? I mean, how is this all going to get reconfigured?
Thank you for the question. I think, that initiative is actually starting earlier this year. At that time, we had a negative supply shock coming from China, basically. And together with some sort of complication with the relationship with China, I think the diversification argument is really coming in that context. And after that, actually, China's production capacity is back already. Then still we have a sort of complicated trade conflict situation over there, but so the situation is really changing a lot. So the countries are probably talking about the different kinds of resilience in different kinds of value chains now. So, but from the viewpoint of Southeast Asia and also maybe South Asia too, so value chains are extremely important in order to keep our international competitiveness. So how we can strengthen our value chains, I think, and also better position in value chains. I think those issues are continuously very important. So, so far actually, in terms of a sort of manufacturing value added, particularly machinery value added, machinery value chains, they are not really reshuffled much. Actually, the production system preserved is preserved pretty much. But from now on, actually, we will have maybe a long-lasting negative demand shock coming from outside, particularly from Europe and also North America. So I think we should do a little bit more reshuffling. Actually, many ASEAN countries are now trying to rather attract production blocks from everywhere, not only from China, but in other parts of the world too. I think we have some sort of shocks coming in, and then we need some sort of reshuffling. So I think sort of inviting value chains would be a sort of very, very important industrial promotion policy in many countries. So, and then also the usage of communications technology enhanced substantially because people cannot move. So many not perfect substitutes, but actually the usage of communication technology really enhanced in this region too. So the next step is a sort of combination of labor and industrial robots or as automation in a kind of really constructive way. I think that will come after COVID-19. So India should catch up with Southeast Asia in that sense. You are a big country. You have a big manufacturing sector. That's good, but not quite open to outside. You should export much more in really strong, competitive manufactured goods too. And also, manufacturing sector is generating a lot of employment too. So I think India has a lot of potential. Probably the trade policy is extremely important on that.
Thank you very much. I think we need a separate session with you on what India should be doing. Maybe RIS could think of that. Thank you very much, all the panelists, each of you, for an excellent presentation by each of you, and bringing out your thoughts on the specific areas of WTO's challenges and WTO's gains from out of WTO and the kind of challenges that we are faced with. It's been a pleasure to moderate this session, and it's been a great learning for me. Thank you all. And as I close, I'll hand it over to Sabyasachi and Sachin for closing this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for leading us through this session. And on behalf of Professor Chaturvedi, I thank all the panelists once again. It was a great learning through this session, and it was extremely insightful. And with the inputs, we will definitely go ahead with the future webinars, and maybe coming back to you sometime for your guidance. And of course, thanks to all the participants and attendees across our social media platforms who have been very eagerly and patiently listening to all of us. And with this, we close for today. Thanks also to our IT team for their excellent support, and the administration at RIS. So once again, good morning, afternoon, and evening to each one of you. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. That's very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good morning.
Bye.
Bye,
Fuku. Bye. Hope to see you soon.
Yeah,
Bye.
see you soon. Bye.